So a few weeks ago, in some satsangs, four satsangs ago or five satsangs ago, I spoke about how I find it hard to put forward a teaching, using too many terms that are not this worldly. So even the word God, because of how it's heard, and frankly, sometimes there seems like there are better words to use than some words that have been used in the past. We can say, well, actually, that works. This word is better to use. So I spoke about how I use some words, such as God, less so. But I acknowledged that the notion of God, and therefore the word God, and any concepts that paint a picture of a universal force are very appealing and resonate with seeking and with seekers, because at certain times when the structure is a certain way, when the suffering and for that matter the seeing things differently are unfolding a certain way, what it feels like is as though we are being held and one with God. It feels like there is direct confirmation of God. And in those moments, anyone who would tell you there is no God would not at all be confirming what is felt, what seems to be revealing itself. And frankly, who knows? Those times may be revealing something more true than when those times pass and the feelings are different. What I've tended to do is see how much change there is within the process. And at first we tend to not register the change relative to other phases. And in each phase it sort of feels like, oh, this is it. This is the truth. Now I've seen something, and inevitably it changes, and we move on to what in hindsight is a progression of insights building on each other, the way we think changing, and progressively, cumulatively changing. And so when this is seen to be the case, then, and especially in relation to insights that feel so true when they're happening, and then we look back and we say, oh, that when that insight happened, I would use certain words because that's what the insight revealed. And then, a year later, when more insights had happened, we realize, we wouldn't quite frame it like that because the picture sort of developed. And then the concepts that we use based on how it then feels as it develops, the concept would be a bit more refined. So that's very important to see that what feels very true at a particular point changes. And so why is my tendency to, in a way, ignore those times when the experience changes, and in that moment it feels like, whoa, that's not at all causal. There can be experiences that would indicate that some part of the experience that I might often explain as being created by the mind, in those moments when it actually happens, it doesn't feel at all like it's created by the mind, so much so that we might say it isn't created by the mind. And so those happen a lot. And what we tend to do is we tend to draw a conclusion that says, this is what revealed itself, this is how it is. Even when it fades away, we tend to refer to how it felt, the memory of how it felt, to say this is how it is, even if it's not that pronounced at the moment, we still hold on to it. Whereas I tend to want to do the opposite and bring everything back to causal, human, in a human world based on thinking, and more so than thinking, but based on cognitive process, where there is a brain in a human being and senses picking up stimuli from an external world and producing modulation, producing a representation of that external world, which is what we know as our experience of life, all arising within human consciousness. Now, when I talk that way and when I relate to life that way, even though those are the explanations that I use, I don't hold that as absolutely the way it is, because the reality, I guess, when we don't kid ourselves, is that we don't ever know one way or the other. If we can come to understand that even profound experience that doesn't feel like experience that feels like it is now showing us the truth, if we come to acknowledge that too may be a fairly subjective, that feels not subjective experience, meaning it's how it's being seen at this time, and it too can change. And so we get lots of examples of that for ourselves in our seeking, and hopefully our intellect clicks on the fact that what feels really real may not be the truth, even though it appears like, this is the truth. So once our intellect has clicked on that, we will, it's a form of critical thinking, we'll just say, I don't know. Sure, it seemed to reveal that everything is arising in consciousness, is spontaneously created, that there is no past, there is no future, there is just this. And yet I don't know. We could say there are experiences that where the consciousness feels to be a consciousness of something much bigger than a body or a human. And so the tendency will say, the consciousness is the consciousness of source that has created the whole universe. And even if there is a sense, a strong sense, even what seems like an absolute sense that that is the truth, our critical thinking will come in and say, I don't know. It doesn't reveal itself with those self-confirming qualities. It feels like it, and it really comes down to your relationship to experience and feel what something feels like, which really is a form of perception, even when it seems like it isn't the standard perception. So then we say, that's, perception has fallen away, meaning where we say, the perceiving of something through the body-mind organism, through a relative instrument, has fallen away. And what is seen as true perception or absolute perception, and we can drop the word perception, what is seen is what is. And if we can go past that assumption that what feels like the absolute is the absolute, we then really have reason to go, I don't know. And very similarly, when when we say I don't know, what I found is that because we have to live our life as a human being, even after these awakenings and liberation, and even after peace of mind on a continuous, unbroken basis sets in, we don't suddenly get pulled out, like no alarm bell goes off in heaven or wherever and say, oh, another one's got it, get him out of there. And then, we're extracted from this world of humanness to live somewhere else. If that was the case, then maybe the seeking is about truth, about realizing what really all this is. Because when you realize what all this is, you get saved, taken out. It's your ticket out of here. But in fact, that doesn't seem to be the gig. So someone might have some awakening, some realization, which might be seen as truth, and yet you still have to live the rest of your life as a human being, as a body that can't jump in front of cars and has to respect the apparent form that will kill you if it hits you. With your preferences, you might not be attached to your preferences being delivered, and yet it's very clear that the body continues to have an aversion to pain, and it will move away from pain when it can. And so if we don't mix up our attachment to preference with preference itself, we'll realize, oh, I do prefer hot weather over cold weather, or savory food instead of sweet food, warm showers instead of cold showers, friendly conversation instead of aggressive conversation. If we don't mix up our attachment, where we might on some level say, I am indifferent to pleasure and pain, because we realize we've stopped feeling attacked by pleasure and pain. And if we don't think that means we have no preference, and we see, oh, I do have a preference, I'm just not attached to it in the same, or identified with outcomes in the same way I was, then we realize I pretty much have to continue to live in this life until physical death of the body, which doesn't imply that we then go to another life. If anything, I would run with the assumption that that's it. Physical death of the body, and life, the presence of daily life, ends, much like, let's say, deep sleep. And I don't hold that absolutely, but those holding and functioning as if, and thinking about life, by and large, as if it is as it appears, causally in a world of form, makes a lot of sense once we, usually after the various awakenings and the falling away of the attachments and things, realize, oh, I can't keep saying that this is not real, I have no preferences, I am consciousness, because there's a body that gets in cars and gets out of cars, go to bed, wakes up, has preferences, has to turn on lights from light switches following rules of cause and effect, and if you want tea you have to put the kettle on. You make plans according to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, January, February, March, April, May, times of the day, and you live your life saying, yes, I'll meet you next Friday, and remembering what you did when you were 10 years ago and what you did yesterday. All of that is seen to be a remaining part of how life continues even after certain dynamics, certain components have fallen away. So my tendency is to say, for all intents and purposes, we can describe life and talk about seeking from a point of view of materialistic causality, and in talking about it that way, we still get to talk about the error the psychological error that gets put in, that interprets the life of materialistic causality and form, interprets that in a way that allows the psychological me to establish and to then start creating this uncomfortableness in the system, in the experience of life. And so, if someone were to say, do you really believe that we are a body in a world of form? And I say, I have no reason to know that we're not. I don't at all believe absolutely that we are. I mean, if imagination can run, I won't say wild, but a little unrestricted, especially after we stop assuming certain things like consciousness can not be mechanical, and we assume that to be the case because usually because our thinking works off it what it knows and says, oh, of course, if I understand the conscious aspect and feel that, doesn't at all feel mechanical. And so once again we then run with what it feels like and say consciousness can't be created by a machine or by a mechanical process. And that's often a conclusion based on a limitation of our thinking. Because, for example, who knows what quantum machinery, what outputs that can produce? Maybe the consciousness that we experience is a possible output of quantum machinery, or machinery that is, I'm just using the word quantum because it's something we tend not to understand relative to Newtonian physics type machinery. So quantum machinery at super high speeds, which is on the quantum level, it's all super high speed. Who knows what outputs it can produce? Maybe consciousness is an output of quantum machinery. But we're very quick to say, oh, the consciousness that I've become aware of can't possibly be a product of machinery. And it's understandable, but to me it's bad thinking. It's a thinking that says, oh, I know that this can't be from there. So if we open up our thinking, the truth is that we could be computers set up to optimize, to learn, and computers that are self-learning and have a sense of self in order to produce permutations and combinations that are optimal for who knows what application. It's a possibility that we are all individual computer programs. I think if we are humans, we are also, essentially, we can look at our thinking as a form of computation. But if we want to let our imagination run even wilder, we might be some sort of quantum machine, or part of, we might be an output inside a quantum machine, where that quantum machine is producing programs that have a sense of self, because in order for the program to optimize, it needs to have a sense of self in order to optimize for maybe entities outside of the machine. And so, we don't know. We don't know what all this is. And I've spent lots and lots of time, years and years now, thinking from what I feel is a sort of a perspective that's opened up compared to what it used to be. And what I keep coming up with is we don't know, and it's not really relevant. We don't need to know. from my perspective, it's amazing to find ourselves here in life, not really knowing what it is. But I think that if we leave out the bit that says, I don't know, but the truth is, it keeps appearing like a world of form with the experience of being a conscious human being. So why don't I treat that as how I'm going to live life? In critical thinking, there's a principle called, I forget what it's called, the name, someone's razor, Ocams razor, or it'll come to me later. And that essentially says that we often overcomplicate things and come up with explanations that are not the obvious explanation. And Ocams razor. And so in non-dual spirituality and a lot of other spirituality, the explanation about what life is really very distant from how things really appear on the surface. And it needs to be in a way, because the way humans form is we take how it appears on the surface and we interpret it a certain way and come up with what is a problematic conclusion. So Ocam's razor, as it is put in place by a developing human, includes too many other critical thinking errors in it. And so what we end up with is a conclusion about life that includes in it all the suffering. And so then the spiritual teachings come along and say, you see, you've got it all wrong. You're taking life on the surface. If you look beyond that, and it creates an explanation that can reveal itself, because the explanation, the non-dual explanation of everything arising in consciousness, is not devoid from being how things happen. Even from the materialistic point of view, we still only have an experience of life arising in consciousness, a subjective appearance of change in consciousness. So the non-dual explanation is completely accurate, at least from a particular perspective, if there is a material world with humans in it. The non-dual teaching still holds true. So those teachings that explain what is not what appears to be, but what is a sort of deeper explanation, tends to veer away from Ocam's razor principle, and we end up with a much more complicated version or not complicated, but one that doesn't sort of, isn't the explanation based on the simplest explanation. So, and it seems like when we drop the explanation that is the explanation that appears on the surface, and we take on the oneness explanation, a whole lot of freedoms come. And so then it seems like this Ocam's razor principle, which is run with the explanation that, or often the simplest explanation is the right explanation, essentially. It seems like that is not an appropriate principle in this case, because the simple explanation created all the suffering, created what we would say is a disconnection from oneself, and not knowing oneself, misidentification with form, and hence suffering and uncomfortableness in life. And seeing a deeper meaning, a deeper explanation, the oneness of everything, tends to move us away from that into a movement that feels more authentic, more real. And what I'm trying to say is, my experience is then to go back, to be taken back to something that is much more in line with how life presents itself, like the simplest explanation, but without a whole lot of the previous critical thinking errors. And that then means that we get to, say, talk about life in ways where we actually can integrate with the rest of the population. They don't need to think that we're crazy, because we're not going around denying aspects of life that continue to exist even after awakenings. We don't need to, when we're interacting with others, interact in a way that doesn't match. Because really, I guess if we come back from the non-dual, knowing ourselves simply as awareness, what's fallen away is the attitude, a certain attitude. And attitude is internal in a way, or not in a way, it's internal. And so there is a middle ground where we can meet, where people of any attitude can meet. And so awakening doesn't mean we can't meet. What it means is we attitudinally won't buy into, or we won't agree with the way someone who is still attached and identified to outcomes, seeing life as imperfect on all levels, wanting it to be different and thinking it should be different on all levels. We won't necessarily buy into that attitude, but we'll understand it, and therefore can remain quiet when someone is seeing life that way and describing life that way, or at least there's an intelligence as to when we can put in an alternative view and when to just remain quiet and allow them to have their view, because we see that that makes sense, actually, given the way that humans develop. And until someone's history, someone's experience of life pushes them to a point where life is seen differently, then they're going to have that experience, that explanation of themselves and life. And so that doesn't mean that we will want to be associated with that all the time. We might find that actually we like spending a lot of time away from that on our own. But the fact is, we're still going to find ourselves interacting. Life is interhuman relationship. And so when that happens, it's nice to be able to find some sort of meeting point, even if it is small talk, knowing that the small talk is a way of connecting, or it might not need to be small talk actually, but we might realize that asking the other person about themselves and what they're doing and what they enjoy is a way of creating connection that is somewhat meaningful. And we might now realize that going into heavily loaded topics like politics and religion and spirituality is best left alone, because it doesn't foster harmonious relationships often. So where are we going? Let's see. So today, after having said all that, I wanted to focus on some of the explanations of life from the non-dual point of view. Because, as I've said, it's a process. And so it isn't appropriate to say the process, or to describe things in purely materialistic and causal ways and leave God out of it, isn't going to be appropriate as an absolute. So I wanted to sort of explain why I come from that position, because I think eventually we have to come back to that and live that way. But there are a lot of rewiring tasks that life has to put in place along the way, and it's great to talk about life in ways that helps that rewiring, or that contributes to the rewiring. And so I wanted to talk about some of the non-dual explanations of reality. So I say as of reality, because that is part of the deliverance of the top-down teachings. And one of the things that causes identification and suffering, and by default, because identification and suffering are linked with the psychological me, the psychological identity, one of the things that causes that is the deeply ingrained belief that I am the body. And when I use this word deeply ingrained belief, what it really means is an obsessive view, an unbalanced view, a view that only sees one side. So I was saying at the beginning of the talk that eventually we have to come back to seeing ourselves as a human being, which includes the body. But that would be a much more balanced view, where it's the body and the consciousness, where the human being is seen to be a combination of consciousness and the body. Whereas we start off developing as human beings from babies and then infants and children, what have you, with what gets put in place is a obsessive view that only sees the gross, and the subtle is left, is overlooked. And so the top-down teachings have to correct that. They have to rewire the neurology that knows itself, or rewire the human being in such a way that the human being can come to know itself in a more holistic, a more open, a less rigid way. And so one of the ways of doing that is to essentially reduce what we're obsessed with to something that is not true. That gives the intellect, gives the system a reason to be less interested in what it has been very interested in for a very long time. And it's been very interested in something for a very long time because it seems to be appropriate. It seems to be what's most important. So the teachings will come along and say, you are not the body. The body is not real. The body is not what you are. That is an illusion. So when we hear that, coupled with the fact that our experience is one where intuitively there's a sense things are not quite right, and then we hear these explanations, and if it's our destiny for that to resonate, then the process begins of an internal repetition inspired by the teachings that continues to reinforce, I am not the body. What I am is consciousness, because the teachings have reminded us, have suggested that to us. And the power of resonance is that once it takes hold, then the process of reconditioning doesn't rely on the teaching to continuously reinforce that. That helps, but if it was just the teaching reinforcing it, it wouldn't be enough. It's when our own thinking kicks in and takes over, sort of grabs the baton from the teaching, and then regularly within the day sees life as described in the teaching, which then means it reminds ourselves, oh, there's that thinking that is getting caught up in life on the basis that I am the body. And the thought arises, you are not the body, you are consciousness. And if it arises in a way that actually makes a difference and maybe brings us into presence, where the thinking that reinforces the idea, I am the body and this is very important, this turns out that way, and it's very important that that person respects me and does what they said they were going to do. If the thought, you are not the body, cuts that off and brings us into a contact with the formless consciousness that is already present or is already complete and doesn't require the other person to do something a particular way, then if that's our destiny, if that's how things happen, that's the process of change. Now, as things change, what it appears like is that we are now seeing the truth. So it feels like a veil is falling away. And so that's why it's described that way, because that's what it feels like. So we can describe the psychological me as a veil of ignorance that obscures the reality of what we are. And it's valid to describe things how it feels. So as this process of these thoughts arising, reminding us you are not the body and dropping us into presence, what it feels like is that there is a layer of thinking that gets in the way of the truth. Another way of looking at what is actually happening, which if we look at it this way helps develop our appreciation of what life might be beyond the explanations of the non-dual teachings. What might be happening is that that thought arising that says you are not the body, inspired by the teachings, which I'll repeat again in case anyone is hearing this strangely, but I understand how we hear things strangely sometimes. If someone might be hearing this as if I'm criticizing a teaching for saying something a certain way. And I've said it many times, I have a great respect, especially for the top-down non-dual teachings, because they address a very complex problem, a very tightly wound identity, and hit it in exactly the way it needs to be hit, with very specific information, such that it undoes it. And so that deserves respect. And so what I'm doing is not at all criticizing the teachings, but giving explanation to why certain things are said. And that explanation, I feel, can in itself be part of the undoing. So So what might be happening is, rather than the truth being revealed, the teachings are delivering information to an intellect that needs to take that on and deliver it to itself over and over as life reminds it, as life inspires the thinking mind, which is the problematic part of the thinking. So the thinking mind refers to the involvement, the suffering. And if the teachings explain that that suffering is because we don't know ourselves, and that we are not the body, we are consciousness, when that involvement of the thinking mind happens, the working mind might kick in and remind us, you are not the body. That might bring us into a presence, meaning a cutting off of that narrative. And what might be happening is that as that happens over and over again, the neurology of the system, or the neurology of the makeup of the neurology, is changing, such that the experience of the world is being produced differently from how it was produced before. Now, for this to make sense, we need to appreciate that life is what we know as life. Our experience of life is a creation. Because if we keep looking at life as the knowing of something, the seeing of something that is independent from that which is aware of it, and then when life is experienced differently, we have to say, oh, now I see what is really out there. Before, I wasn't seeing what was out there because of misperception, let's say. So we're now saying, okay, before, my mind was distorting the image of what was out there, or was creating a distorted image of what was out there. And then, magically we jump to this other conclusion, which doesn't make sense when we see it in hindsight. And that is, oh, now I know life directly, not as perception, no longer through the veil of the mind. Now, why that seems to make sense is because part of the change is a oneness, a knowing oneself as formless awareness, where when certain faculties shut down, the experience changes, qualitatively changes. And so the sense then is, what I am is not something physical. What I am is something, not even something, is nothing, is formless, is awareness. And the teachings that have taken us that far talk about that as being the absolute, that being primordial, that being reality, being prior to all of the form, and that can be aware of itself, and that is direct knowing. That is not a knowing of the relative kind, which is a knowing of thinking. And qualitatively, that's what the new experience feels like. And so we're very good at being prompted. We see examples of it in mentalists that know how to get you to, for example, pick the number 5 or say the word banana by saying certain things to you before they ask you the question, simply because they understand the way that the brain works. So we're very prone to suggestion. And the teachings, the top-down non-dual teachings that put forward certain concepts as this is the truth, which is not a criticism, but rather that's the methodology, bring about a change, and the change feels like the concepts that have been described, and therefore our thinking says it is as it's described, which means the whole combination of things is a perfect storm for us to then see life as it feels, and as it feels is that now the truth of what is out there is seen, rather than maybe appreciating, oh, what's happening is the whole experience is being created anew, and this, what we could say, awakened experience is what is being created anew, and that there is no truth in either the previous experience of knowing oneself as the body and suffering, or in the awakened experience. They are both subjective experiences. One that feels like it's not subjective, because when we compare it to the other one, it's different. And so another thinking error is to compare something that is more relative than something that is less relative than it. And what we tend to know is the difference. What we tend to experience is the difference. So if you have hot water and warm water, the warm water relative to the hot water could actually be considered neutral. Whereas if you then test the warm water next to neutral temperature water, what is neutral temperature water? Less warm water, then the warm water that seemed neutral next to the hot water will now seem hot next to the less hot water. So we take two subjective experiences. We have two subjective experiences. One that includes in it components that are very relative, like thinking, like perception from the perspective of a body, which is a very relative instrument, influenced by thought, the thought component, the judging, the labeling, the processing of what is seen through thinking. So we have that experience, which is, let's call it the standard experience of life. And then a new experience is created, maybe because the instrument has been changed through a process, and so the instrument is then creating a new modulation. And that modulation has certain components that are absent. And if those components that are absent are very relative components that are create a very subjective quality to them, or have a very subjective quality to them, often just our judgment, our preference that says this is good, that's bad. Once that's fallen away, because we're encouraged to not call anything good or bad, because that is what creates separation. Once that falls away, life is known subjectively or qualitatively quite differently. And you compare the two ways of knowing life, and you can easily say, oh, this is reality, and that was seeing life through a lens of subjectivity. And hopefully at some point we come and see, oh, what feels like reality is also seen or is also subjective, but different subjective, so it feels different. And so what I'm hammering on here is the fact that maybe it is an instrument that is responsible for creating the experience, for creating the world as we know it, including a representation of what within the experience seems like the subject, seems like the entity creating the experience. So the human being is part of the experience created. And that experience, what we know as the daily life experience, may well be the creation of an entity, something like a human being, or a computer, or a universal God that has nothing outside of it and creates a spontaneous experience of life within itself. Now, whether it's all of this experience is an experience within a universal God or a computer, assuming we don't really understand what a computer can output. So could a computer create a sense of self? You know, the standard response, which I don't want anyone to try and convince me of, is, oh, computer can't create consciousness. There's all sorts of arguments for and against, and the truth is human intellect isn't going to know this anytime soon, and it's not important to know it. So if you're sure about something, question that. Right? So it's great if someone is saying, no, it can't be that. There's your work. Right? Your work is to come to, I don't know. Ocams razor, if you go with Ocams razor, which at some point is very appropriate, we say, well, why can't it be the experience of an entity? But my point wasn't to go away from the non-dual to that. I still want to talk about the non-dual teachings, and with what I've just said, maybe understand why the non-dual teachings put forward the concepts that they do. Already to know the experience as a subjective experience, or actually some of the changes, some of the shifts that happen through the top-down non-dual teachings is that we don't, for a period, know the experience as a subjective experience. In fact, as I mentioned, for a while, the new experience is not at all considered to be a subjective experience, but rather to be the direct knowing of what we would call, so this shows where our thinking gets a bit disconnected for certain phases along the way. What it feels like is the knowing of pure subjectivity, which is awareness or consciousness. When the shift happens, there is an appreciation of the awareness or the consciousness in which the experience arises. And because the relationship of subject-object has fallen away, because the teachings have hammered home, what is aware of life is not the body. What is aware of life is the consciousness of Source, or God, or awareness, with a capital A, that is primordial, prior to all of the arising. And so life is then known from the perspective of the absolute, which we would call the subject. But because the experience arises as a non-dual experience or non-dual non-experience, where the thinking has fallen away, and therefore the distance between that which knows the objects and the objects has also fallen away. And there is a sense of immediacy and being that which knows everything that arises within it. And so for a while, life is not at all considered life from that perspective, which is at that time not seen as a perspective, but rather seen as truth revealed. So life then is not seen as a subjective experience, but the end of subjective experience. Now, that in itself is a huge rewiring of what was there previously. And what was there previously was problematic. What was there previously was keeping in place the psychological me, the psychological identity. And as I started off saying, that psychological identity is identified, obsessively identified with form, with time, with space, with causality, in such a way that the psychological me is simultaneously created with those notions. A me that is directly affected by circumstance and outcomes, a me that feels added to or subtracted from, a me that feels like it's fighting for its survival. It's a me with a mine. This is me and mine. Seeing the other as a competitor, a rival. And so something needs to be done about it. And that's where the non-dual teachings come in, to break that form, to rewire the system so that the experience of life can be created differently. And in that newly created experience, the identity is less there than before. The other two parts that are hammered home is there is no time. There is no causality. What is happening is a spontaneous arising in consciousness that you can know yourself as, and that you can only know yourself as that prior to thinking, not through thought, by knowing life as it is without the functioning of the thinking mind, without the functioning of the working mind for that matter. And the notion of causality, the notion of time, is hammered home as being the error on which the me, the person, exists. And the present moment is pointed at as being devoid of time, that the past doesn't exist, the present doesn't, the future doesn't exist. All that is this now, and that all of the objects that we previously have referred to as objects that have existed for years, trees that are 50 years old, are not that at all. They are simply an object arising in the present moment, and that just because a tree appears to be big, and our concept is that trees get big over time, the whole point of the teaching is to say that is not how a big tree appears. A big tree is simply, like everything else, an appearance in this moment, and that appearance can be created exactly as Source would like to create it. So if the big tree, if Source wanted the big tree to vanish, it could in the next moment make the big tree vanish out of the appearance. And it doesn't do that in order for the illusion of time and space to remain intact. However, if you can see that the tree is an appearance arising right now, and that it's only a projection of a certain type of thinking that says, oh, a tree has to come from a seed that takes time to germinate, and then the tree takes time to grow. And so I only know a tree because it existed over time and was planted in the past. And the teaching say, can't you see that that is all a concept? And they're right. Not absolutely necessarily right. In fact, as I say, all teachings are exactly that. And what is put forward is a concept. And a concept, whatever has been written down in the past or said in the past, is a concept and not the truth. Now, a lot of teachings don't hammer that point home because they rely on the concepts being taken as truth. And I have no problem with that. In fact, as I said, I think that's fantastic. So we can have this insight. I hope you even have it when I'm saying it, when I'm talking about what the non-dual teachings say, but sort of like a magician revealing the magician's trick, but not in a way that should spoil anything, hopefully in a way that adds to it. So if you see, if in this moment that, oh, my assumption that the lamp was, or the table was created by a carpenter is unverifiable. Even if a man comes in and says, I am the carpenter that created that table 5 years ago, it's just a concept, or words that someone is telling you. Even if if he comes up and shows you pictures, photographs of him working on the table, and there's a progression of the table from, its early stages of development through to it being polished and whatever. They're just pictures in the present moment. They don't prove anything. It could all be an elaborate setup. And so time and causality, because in the same way, what appears to be a rock hitting a window and breaking the window is an appearance in the present moment. So it means the rock is an object in the present moment. And when I say object, I don't mean a physical object, but a sense object, or part of the experience object. And the window is here, and the rock in the experience is moving, hits the window, and then the window breaks. But our assumption is, based on how we know life, of cause and effect and time and form and physics and all of that. And so it appears like the rock is breaking the window. The teachings are saying that is the illusion. In a dream at night, where a rock hits a window and the window breaks, there really is no window and there is no rock. There is just the experience of a rock hitting a window, and it has to all be created as an imagination in consciousness. The image of the window, the image of the rock, the movement of the rock towards the window, and the movement of the glass in fragments falling to the ground is all created. And this breaking of the spell of taking time and causality and form as absolutely real is paramount to the problem of identification and attachment to outcomes. When I say paramount, I'm not saying that it's paramount to, meaning it's very important to the dissolving of the problem of identification and attachment to outcomes, but time and causality isn't in and of itself the problem. The problem is this identification, this identity that is set up, that knows itself and life a certain way. And in order for that identity to be shaken up and changed, life needs to be described differently. And in an instant, when we realize that our experience of life includes this layer of interpreting it through the assumption of time and causality and form as reality, and not seeing that the experience is a momentary arising, and that a tree may well not have existed beyond or prior to this moment. So what I'm suggesting is that according to the teachings, the top-down teachings, if consciousness wanted an apple to float past in this moment, and that's what consciousness manifested as, that's what would happen. An apple would float past in this moment. Why not? We know that in dreams, the laws of physics don't need to apply. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of sort of floating or gliding above the surface or defying gravity in certain ways. And we know in dreams that the sequence of time is altered. And why doesn't that happen in daily living? Now, one of the answers that would be given is that consciousness wants to maintain a certain illusion, and the illusion is revealed not by consciousness placing a floating apple in front of you or a disappearing tree, but rather through awakenings, realizations that the tree is actually an appearance in consciousness, meaning that if you in an instant, what we call turning our head away from the tree no longer exists in the appearance. And our thinking that takes life to be as it has appeared, as our thinking has set in place, says, oh yeah, but the tree exists outside of what I see. And the teachings are saying, are you sure? That's your assumption, and the truth is the tree doesn't exist unless it appears inside consciousness, inside your experience. Now, you'll notice that if you look at the non-dual teachings, they go to an extreme of saying, let's say the tree doesn't exist unless it arises in your consciousness. And why they're saying that is to highlight to you that the tree is only ever an appearance. It is never actually an objective tree. And when we click at what it's saying everything is an appearance and not an objective item. It's all a subjective appearance. Nothing is objective. What happens is we click like, oh, the table is not an object. If we refer to it as an object, we refer to it as a subjective object, which means it's not an object of form, but an apparent object, meaning we realize the whole of the experience of life, including the body and the thoughts and the emotions and the sky, is all a subjective appearance. And in that moment of realizing that, our thinking goes a little too far and then says, oh, there is nothing outside. It needs to. It's great that it's realized there's nothing outside of the moment of the experience. But do we know that there's nothing outside? No, we don't really know there's nothing outside, but the important point is that we've realized that what we do know is always inside our consciousness. That's a big shift that the non-dual teachings have brought about. Not only do they attack time and space, causality, past, future, form, but it works on another cementing factor of our current experience of life, and that is our obsession with labeling, and labeling things according to our standards, not realizing that our standards are in themselves very subjective. So this is where it is a bit confusing. On the one hand, we realize life is not objective, and at the same time, we need to see the subjectivity of, for example, our labeling and our judgments. And so even the subjective is described as a problem or wrong or illusion. And that's why when we know life free of all of these concepts of time and space and labeling, it feels like that is the absolute. So what I mean by this is we're told that, when you say that person is doing something bad, that is a judgment based on your idea of how life should be, of what is good and what is bad. And so we're given examples of how in history certain standards that are now considered to be immoral were considered fine because the culture was different, the beliefs were different. And so what we now say is bad at some point was fine. And so trying to highlight that our judgment is based very much on existing standards, and those standards are very changeable. It's also pointing out that how do you know when you look at something and say it's bad, what we're often doing is we're negating it as being valid in any way. So our thinking says that is bad, it's not valid. By doing that, what we're essentially doing is separating life into what is valid and what is invalid, which means intellectually, psychologically, we are not seeing life as a whole. We can't see life as a whole if psychologically the thinking is dividing things into good and bad, accepting the good and rejecting the bad, because that is creating a split in the oneness that cannot be split. And so this suggestion to stop labeling, because it is based very much on your idea about how life should be, rather than seeing life as it is and not making half of life or a large part of life invalid. That suggestion is trying to heal the split, the psychological splitting that happens through this process of labeling. And that's when we're going through that phase, we'll be saying it's all good, or it just is. There is no good or bad. And what once again is happening is our own system is now reminding ourselves of it has seen the error of labeling things as good and bad in such a way that we are taking the whole, taking life which is unfolding. So the story of the Chinese farmer that is maybe, where something bad happens and then it turns into something good and then it turns into something bad. And the Chinese farmer is like, when his neighbors say, "Oh, I'm so happy for you," he says, "Maybe." When they say, "Oh, I'm so sad for you because something bad has happened," he says, "Maybe." Because he's essentially saying, how do we know that what is labeled bad is really bad? Because it might be part of a bigger picture. And in the bigger scheme of things, it just is. And there are very many ways that teachings can point out how our thinking is doing certain things that causes certain problems in our life. And when we realize, when we have a aha moment and see the psychological projection that previously wasn't seen because it was happening so spontaneously with how life unfolds, and we knew it, or we felt it as being, that's not there's no psychological layer on there. I don't understand what you mean there's no good and bad. It just isn't seen to be something that's happening until the description happens in life in a certain way where we go, oh. So today in the satsang, when I said the tree, we assume that the tree that we see in front of us existed 20 years ago because it's a big tree. For someone out there, it might have been, oh yes, I assume that the table is a table that was made a long time ago. We might have the memory of buying the table 5 years ago in a shop. And if we question even the memory as being, and see the memory as not necessarily a memory of something that happened, but an object, a thought object arising in the present moment, and what if that is constructed to create the impression? So the more that what we think are proving factors of time, memory is a big one, the more we see them as spontaneous objects that may not tell us what we think they tell us, the more that our assessment of life as we have known it, and we are sure that that's the way it is, starts to change, starts to collapse. So many of you will know that often I talk about spiritual seeking as being essentially about a very specific change. Today I've been talking about changes that are the changes that the top-down non-dual teachings focus on, and they bring about those changes by essentially suggesting that the seeking is about truth, about realizing oneness and all sorts of things. And there's no problem with that. It's not what I say is the ultimate reason for seeking, but you might have gathered that maybe they say what they say for a good reason. When we really, at some point, start making it practical and saying, what good would truth be if truth was just for the sake of truth? If we got truth, if we were wishing for truth, and because truth sounds to us, to humans, with our human thinking, like a very valuable thing. Especially when you compare true to unreal, as its counter-opposite. We say, I don't want the unreal, I want the real. I don't want the untruth, I want the truth. I don't want the illusion, I want the knowing. Now, so we can form an expectation of a value, we can value truth. What good is truth? How many people would ask for truth if God came down and says, okay, John, you can have one wish. I'll grant you your one wish. And John happens to be a non-dual seeker for 4 years, and he's waiting and craving what is described in the esoteric teachings, and he's at a phase where it's all about truth, not realizing that the teachings talk about truth maybe to bring about change. Why do I say this? I say, from my perspective, there is no truth. That's what, after having sought for truth for a long time as a seeker, and then come to understand the limitations of the limitations within life, at some point you realize there is no truth that I can know, and that truth is irrelevant, really. But anyway, God's come down to John and said, you can have a wish. And so John thinks, what's most important to me? It's my seeking is most important. Liberation is most important. And liberation is about truth. God, I just want the truth. So God says, you sure, John? John says, yes, I've thought about it long, and that's what's most important, is the truth. So let's say God gave John the truth and nothing changed. And so John's going, well, is this it? And God says, well, yes, you wanted the truth, and I've given you the truth. Let's say he's given it to him in a book, or however, in a jar, or a necklace or something, or a seeing. It's like, the truth, and then nothing really changes. We'd say, well, what good is the truth, really? John would say, well, God, actually, can you take it back? I'll have something else. Sorry, John, it's too late. You asked for what you wanted, and I gave it to you. I gave you the truth. Now, a lot of people out there are going, no, but the truth will set us free. The truth will deliver a consequence. There will be a consequence. If I know the truth, the false self will fall away. And then if the false self will fall away, then there'll be no more suffering. Or if we might have asked for oneness. It's like, instead of truth, oneness. I want to know oneness. And so you get a oneness experience. But let's say your suffering still is there, then I can assure you that the oneness experience, if suffering is still there, to the seeker will go, hang on, this isn't what I thought. Now, once again, some of you, in the same way as you would have an objection to what I'm saying because of truth, in the same way you'd have the same objection because of oneness. Why you're having the objection is because somewhere in your system you understand that knowing the truth or oneness is going to dissolve the identity because it's not true, or the reality is non-dual, not dual. So if you know oneness or non-duality, then the error, the problem will fall away. So really it isn't oneness or truth that you're really looking for. It's the end of the suffering, or the end of the uncomfortableness. And so if I say there is no truth, as I see it, I don't know any truth. I mean, sure, I would say there is an appreciation of consciousness, but to me now it's the consciousness of the human being. I don't say that that's some sort of truth. It's truth relative to not being aware of it, which is an overlooking of something, let's say. But it's not some sort of absolute truth. So the Chinese saying is, be careful what you wish for, you might just get it. It's really saying, be sure that you're wishing for the right thing. Oh God, I want a supermodel. Be careful, you might just get it. So what are we really looking for? Is it oneness? Is it truth? Both of those, to me, are irrelevant. Except as far as they are relevant to the changing of the structure and the thinking of the human being that causes suffering. And they're not relevant, truth and oneness are not relevant to the end of suffering because oneness and truth is some sort of absolutism that brings about the end of suffering. I would say that the changes that happen go much beyond oneness or truth. Those are topics that get introduced to us that get us to think about life differently. And when I say think about life differently, it might mean the stopping of certain thinking. So really, it's all relevant. It's all got its place. God, even. I mean, at some point, the most important notion in the undoing was the fact everything is predetermined. Everything is unfolding exactly according to God's will. And prior to that, what that meant, or prior to the change in what that means, which is often I've described predetermination as being essentially a result of a causality that is inevitably going to turn out one way. But before I saw it that way, I was saying everything is predetermined, everything is a creation in consciousness, meaning consciousness is creating the tree and an apple could float past if consciousness wanted to create it. Consciousness as source has created the body and the feelings and the thinking, and that allowed an allowing of everything to be as it is, because it was all created by source to be exactly the way it is. And how can I argue with that? There's no, it all is. If we see life as an arising in consciousness, then the notion of this is good and that is bad and this should be and shouldn't be just falls away. It all is according to God. This life is a story, life is a creation according to God's will. And whether I have good luck or bad luck, whether I meet someone, whether I speak to someone, whether I fall asleep or not, whether I make a certain investment, whether I get a job, who my parents are, all of that is created. And I am the witness. And when I say I, I'm talking about I as the awareness is a witness to all of that which is created within that which is within that which is the witness of it. So the witness is not something apart from what is created, but really the witness means witnessing. There is just witnessing. No witness or witnessed, just witnessing from the perspective of the consciousness in which everything is arising, and from which everything has been created. That is the non-dual awakening realization. And in that, that's the awakening, let's say, or one of the awakenings. And within that, from that perspective, everything is God. And the mantra, but a mantra from a point of seeing that kept arising over and over for years, and seeing life from this perspective where the tree is just an arising and the other person is an arising, and this body is also, just like the other person, an object in the present moment, an object, not a physical object, a subjective object, or and maybe not even subjective or objective, but neither subjective nor objective, just what is known by that in which it is arising and of which it is made and not separate from. And that, for a long time, was the appreciation of life. And it sort of creates this awe and this wandering around where you essentially would sit on a park bench and just watch the world go past, feeling like none of my worldly concerns that were there in the past are relevant from the point of view of knowing oneself as this formless awareness. So God is relevant. Everything is God. All there is God. Because that cuts off the psychological me. The psychological me is the non-appreciation of everything being exactly the way it's meant to be. The psychological me is in resistance to the psychological me wants life to be a particular way, doesn't feel complete unless life is a certain way. And doesn't feel complete when life is that certain way either. It can never be complete. It is a figment that is forced to be uncomfortable. Let's take some questions. Hi, Isabel. Hi, Isabel.
It's been a long time.
Hello. Yes, it has.
I'm really happy to be there today. First, I wanted to tell you what was happening very briefly during those almost 6 months. I just quit your satsangs because I realized I began to be addicted to them. So I said that's something is not right in this. So I just wanted maybe to improve on me what your teachings were doing, and if I could survive without them in a way. And since 6 months, it's sort of unbroken peace of mind. So I want to tell you that
That's excellent.
It's so. I mean, really, it's great. It's like a complete change because things just I don't see them the way I saw them before, and it's really so more easy in daily life. So first, I wanted really to say how it was good to listen to you, and so. And then I'm always
to stop,
doing.
right?
Sorry.
It was good to listen to me and good to stop.
Yes, exactly. It was good to listen to you and good to stop. So I really had this feeling. I was needing you, and I didn't need you anymore. I don't know how to say that.
Yeah, there'll be no one listening on Wednesday. I'll turn up at Zoom and there'll be one person in there. Everyone else will try stopping.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
Wednesday you have a Zoom?
No, this live satsang, I mean.
Okay. I don't remember what I was saying. So that's for really one part. The other thing, as I'm still feel a seeker, but not suffering about it at all. It's really like not even. I know it's maybe paradoxal. It's not a suffering. It's like you want to understand something. For example, for always what I'm seeking for these non-duality teachings, I really like, for example, it happens like that really every day, or not every moment, but very often. One day I realized I was in the street, and then it's like you were telling about the tree, that just I was meeting people or crossing people, and I had this really ingrained feeling that, oh, they just appear now, and then they disappear. And so it was for the first time understanding something little of, I think you were teaching about that just things appear in your you are aware of what's happening. Is that? But then when I look outside, for example, and I see a plane or a bird, I can say the same thing. But I have not made the shift yet, because when I see a tree, sometimes I see it appearing, as you say, just, oh, it's a tree. It's never existed before. But then when I come back 1 hour later and I again see this tree, then then I begin to doubt and say, wow, so what am I, what's happening? Is it just appearing, or is it something in my memory that is arising and that makes me think this tree is appearing? So there is this not clear thing about things appearing and what my memory creates, and there I am.
Mm-hmm.
I
Well,
you understand what I mean?
sure. In the daily living aspects of the teaching, and what I would say the more integrated, which means integrating the non-dual realization, let's say that everything is just a fresh appearance. And so even when you see the tree again, what seems like again, and it seems like the same tree in the same position, you say, well, it is just a new experience with a memory that I have seen it before. That's the non-dual, one of the non-dual realizations, let's say. But the integration is integrating that back into daily living, which really means we then relate to the tree in the old way, mostly. I relate to the tree as if it was planted 10 years ago, because the integrated, or 50 years ago, the integrated view to me says time and space is as real and unreal as spontaneous creation. So what tends to happen is when we see something this new way, we think, oh, that's reality and the other is illusion, which is another layer of duality, right? And we've come to see that because the teachings have got rid of a certain layer of duality, dualistic thinking. So the teachings have got rid of our labeling of things as good and bad in such a way that it splits the experience. And so we see the whole experience as an arising. But then we can create another layer of dualistic thinking that says causality is not real and spontaneous arising is real, right? So then we've created the real or the unreal causality and the real spontaneous creation. And we need to fix that split. So how do we fix that split? By realizing causality on a level is as real as spontaneous creation, because the spontaneous creation, if that's what it is, includes causality in it. Things continue to appear as if they are causal, and at some point, the teachings have hammered home causality is not real, time is not real, everything is spontaneously created fresh in this moment. And so we're forced, in a sense, to create a new dualistic thinking of real and unreal. So I'm saying now we need to realize that too is a problem. So then we come back to a place where we say causality is as real and unreal as spontaneous creation is, it's as real and unreal as that, which really means spontaneous creation is as real and unreal as causality. Why? Because to me there are two aspects of the creation. And we can't pick out one aspect and say that's real and the other is not real. That is part of the teaching methodology, to separate them, to be able to create a shift. Then it needs to be reintegrated, where we come to accept causality as real as spontaneous creation. And that is what creates the real paradox. That's when we have a real paradox where I'm not saying one is real and the other is unreal. I'm saying they're both as real and unreal as each other. And that's where the paradox starts to become real. Then you won't have your problem that you're talking about, because you can say, oh, I can relate to the tree as if it has been there for 50 years, because that's how it appears. And one perspective is that, yes, it has been there for 50 years. I don't know that it hasn't. The other is, it is all just, life is just a spontaneous creation, because even if the tree has been there 50 years, the fact is that you only ever know what you know in this moment. And sometimes it's the tree that may or may not have been there for 50 years. And so the spontaneous view is also correct, but when they come together and they don't get in the way of each other, and you can talk about the tree as if it was a tree that was planted, on your 10th birthday and now you're 60. And you can also know life from this is all there is, and they're not in opposition with each other. That to me is the integrated version. And it's the real paradox. It's like, so which one is it? Our thinking wants to know, which one is it? Is it the tree? Is the tree been there for 50 years, or is it just arising now? And I say, it's neither, and it's both. And our head has a problem with that until it doesn't have a problem. When it doesn't have a problem, it's like, oh, brilliant. When it clicks. And that's what I mean. We mean you have to live as if it's real. And as if doesn't mean pretending it's real. On some level, the reality of the tree, as in the reality of the tree as form, is more real than knowing the tree is just appearance. And yet, from another perspective, what we feel as a real tree is just an experience of a real tree. So we can argue for both. And when we can argue for both, then the paradox comes together. Most people are not arguing for both. Most people are arguing for one or the other, right? The freshly awakened non-dual seekers are arguing for spontaneous creation, and they've got, a big issue with causality and time and whatever. And sometimes people are arguing for the opposite, especially if they see this error of arguing for the spontaneous only. Then they'll argue for causality and form and all of that. And really the healthy position is where it is neither and it is both, and it's fine, and it's a paradox, and it's no problem, and we get to live happily ever after.
No, you were saying once about the two part of a coin. Mm-hmm. And so it's sometimes you may see one part and sometimes the other part of the coin, and then it's a way of navigating. Well, that's here at the point I am navigating between once it's appearing and once it's not appearing. But it's, I don't know if it's something I know because you or other teaching says it, or it's not like I always feel it, like I can feel peace of mind. You see what I mean? It's not.
Which is
there.
Good. I was going to say when you're talking, but actually that's not so important. Knowing life is spontaneous all the time, or oneness all the time, or causal all the time. How that presents is not so important. What's important is the continuous unbroken peace of mind. So if we shift our focus to continuous unbroken peace of mind, then at some point we go, who cares whether the tree is real or unreal, or an appearance, or been there 50 years? Who cares? I know that I shouldn't drive my car into the tree. Because we'll have problems then.
don't know why we are seekers. So it's just that.
Yeah, well, I think as more and more of these things stop being an issue, because maybe we, for example, realize who cares whether the tree is real or unreal. And that really kicks in when more and more peace of mind is there, or at least we appreciate the peace of mind that's there and realize actually it's all about peace of mind. Then any remaining thinking that might be concerned about understanding the bits that led to peace of mind, then we realize, oh, that's like, the teachings tell us don't carry the canoe on your back once you've got to the other side of the river. Don't carry your tools around once you've done the job. And it's a bit like that with this seeing or understanding the non-dual. It's a method. It's part of the methodology. It's not the thing itself. So for me, at some point I've mentioned there was this very profound oneness experience that essentially intensified the intensity of oneness from, let's say, the very standard level 4 oneness, which was the witnessing, and then it went to like level 10, where all separation of every sort fell away, and it felt very, very different. And I was sure that was what I was sure that is what was important. And then Ramesh said, don't worry, that was just an experience. What you're really looking for is peace of mind. And peace of mind is not a oneness experience. You can have peace of mind without a oneness experience. And I knew that because my life was largely peace of mind, except for the craving for the oneness experience when that kicked in. And when I refocused onto peace of mind and realized that craving or even thinking about oneness was the remaining obstacle to continuous unbroken peace of mind, I said, who cares about a oneness experience? And that was the end of peak experiences. So my conclusion now is that the peak experiences are sometimes created because we value them so much, because we're thinking about them so much, because we've come to believe that is how life should look, because we've been told, life should look like oneness. And it makes sense that our brain will produce that, the experience that it is being told is how life should look. Our brain does that all the time with, shadow lines and things like that. Once again, the illusionists understand how our brain produces reality. So they put certain lines on a wall with shading, and our brain will tell us that there is depth to a wall that is two-dimensional, just because of shading lines. So our brain knows how to interpret things and then create a model of it. And so if the brain is told that the world should be oneness and that separation doesn't exist, and that's all we're focused on, and that we're not the body, and it will create those experiences. And once we lose interest in that, those experiences stop happening. And we're convinced when those experiences start happening that, now we're seeing reality, that reality is being revealed. And I think it's just the intensity of our seeking and diving into explanations of life that create that experience of life. And that's why I keep saying, what are we really looking for? We're looking for unbroken peace of mind as the human being, for the human being. So if you have that, like you've been experiencing for the last 6 months, then a lot of these other things, maybe you can say, maybe they're not as important as I'm thinking they are.
I'll try to put that beside me. Anyway, thank you, Roger, always. It was such a gift. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You can take another 6 months off now.
Sometimes what I do, I pick one of your teaching and I just listen to this one until I understand something. That's sometimes what I did.
That's
so
great.
I'll see.
This is one of the things that our thinking doesn't do. It thinks, oh, I've heard it, I've watched that movie, so I won't watch it again, or I've read that book, or I've listened to that satsang. I think we should listen to a satsang, 20 or 30 times, and then we know it well. So
more and more things, because of that, appear to be more clear, and that's great.
Good one. Thanks, Isabel.
So I keep listening. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's 11. Oh, it's 11. All right, I won't take any more questions. And, well, see you on Wednesday if you don't choose to take a 6-month break.